Danielle DiMartino Booth, CEO and Director of Intelligence for QI Research.
Danielle, it's the front page of the Wall Street Journal above the fold.
She is considered one of the best on the street.
Well, hello again. This is Danielle DiMartino Booth with QI Research, and I'm here today with the third episode with my great partners at ITM Trading. Today, we're going to talk about a phenomena that I didn't really, have a name for, which my 4 teenage kids think is rather amusing. I did not know about the term gaslighting. What I have appreciated more and more going forward is the pains that the mainstream and the financial media have been going through to convince working Americans, men and women, that a lot of the things that are ailing them are collective figments of their imagination. So anyways, I'm going to throw my readers on. So my children have informed me that we're being gaslit. So according to Merriam-Webster, gaslighting is the psychological manipulation of a person, usually over an extended period of time, that causes the victim to question the validity of their own thoughts, perception of reality or memories, and typically leads to confusion, loss of confidence and self-esteem, uncertainty of one's emotional or mental stability, and a dependency on the perpetrator. It sounds pretty darn tootin' serious and grave to be saying that the media is trying to perpetrate gaslighting. By the same token, though, listen to what some of the people are saying when they're being interviewed and compare that to a lot of the official data in what we know to be an election year. And you start to realize, maybe it's not the working men and women of America who are kind of crazy. Maybe they are actually being gaslit. Here is, what I would call the most obvious representation of this that we've seen. This came out of The Guardian's United States branch. This is a UK publication. It went a little viral recently, and the word that they used in their original headline was wrongly. Why most Americans wrongly think that the United States economy is in recession. This was an email that I got from The Guardian. I seem to be on their mailing list. I didn't really notice it until I received this, but it says, according to most Americans, things are pretty bleak, but most Americans, as it turns out, are wrong. I said, well, wow, that's okay. We don't know ourselves. So this is that's the definition of gaslighting. 56% of Americans think the U.S. is in recession, though we're technically not. 49% believe the unemployment rate is at a 50-year high, even though it's at a 50-year low. That's actually technically, officially true. And 72% think inflation's still increasing, but it's falling. That's actually patently false. Inflation is rising to a lesser extent than it was, say, 12 months ago. 49% believe the stock market's down for the year, but it's actually up. That last one we can explain really easily. And that is, most Americans are not necessarily exposed to the stock market. As we hear time and again, the concentration of stock market assets are in the hands of less than 10% of the U.S. population. Let's throw up our first graph. This kind of shows what our collective imagination is telling us about declining job prospects. The less familiar of the two is going to be the yellow line. It comes from Civic Science, and every 2 weeks it comes out with a fresh survey of Americans, and it queries them as to the general state of the U.S. economy. And one of the things that it asks specifically is what you think your prospects are of getting a new job. So it has recently fallen to a post-pandemic low. In other words, if you lose your job right now, you're concerned more than you've been at any other point since the pandemic ended that you're not going to find another job. The more familiar survey certainly comes from the University of Michigan, but we're seeing there again that people's expectations of finding a job if they lose theirs, people's expectations of their spouse finding a job if they lose one, is falling as well. That's not depicted here, but that is declining as well. So the question is, are we imagining this? Is this a figment of our collective imagination, or is it taking a long time, as we discussed in the second episode, for the revisions to catch up with the reality that we're seeing on the ground, given that we know through the first 5 months of 2024 that we're going to see about 500,000 job cuts announced. And that compares to just shy of about 417,000 at this same point in 2023. So given what U.S. workers are hearing from their employers, they're certainly not imagining that declining job prospects are a thing. They're a real thing. Now, this is not to say, again, that inflation has disappeared. Inflation is not actually falling. That was done intentionally or that was an editor's misunderstanding of how inflation works. What we know from Trueflation is that earlier in 2024, we actually saw inflation rising by south of 2%. That was about the lowest it had been. That's since ticked up to about 2.6%. The pace at which prices are rising compared to how much they were rising a year ago. Is it anything like the 10% double digit nearly figures that we saw several years ago? No, it's not that bad. Inflation's not running off the rails, but until we get actual deflation, prices falling, we're not going to start to crawl our way back to where we were in 2019. And historically speaking, odds are we'll never get there. We'll never see a dozen eggs priced at where they were, call it in November of 2019. It's just not going to happen. Now, prices are rising at a less fast pace. So focus in on the green line here. And that shows you that compared to where Americans were about the bad news that they were hearing about rising prices, that's come way off its peak. But note that it's stabilized at still a very high level in this long time series. This is what gets us to the idea of gaslighting and shame on the media. What's changed is that we don't think that our paychecks are going to be able to keep up with the pace of inflation, even if inflation in isolation is not rising at the same pace that it was when it was rising at a breakneck speed. There were fewer employees out there for the taking when quiet quitting was a thing, when Americans were being paid, the least skilled Americans were being paid by the federal government twice what they'd been making prior to the pandemic to sit on the sidelines, to get out of the workforce. This was before we had millions of immigrants come to the United States that have taken up a lot of those least skilled positions. So wage inflation isn't what it once was. The paycheck growth is not what it once was, and yet inflation remains stubbornly high. What does that mean? That means that after you cover the cost of your essentials, that your paycheck's having a harder time keeping up with what it costs to run your household in total. And that's why you've seen this purple line tick back up. It's because your paycheck can't keep up with inflation. Had wages been rising, were wages rising, at the same pace that they were, then we wouldn't have this kind of problem, this kind of tension. Now, how are we seeing this manifest? That's the next question. So as far as corporate America is concerned, they're not seeing the same instance of inflation. What you're looking at here is how many times companies in the S&P 500 stock index have cited inflation on their earnings calls. Now you see with that yellow line that it's come down quite a bit off its peak, still not again where it was prior to the pandemic. And other prices are still higher than they were prior to the pandemic, but it's no longer nearly as problematic. And you'll notice that it has ticked down in pace with the quarterly consumer price index, the growth thereof, which has also come down to a level that is still higher than it was prior to the pandemic. Danielle, you're repeating yourself. I know. It's for a good reason. Did I mention I've got 4 teenagers? The more times you say it, the more it sinks in. That's also, however, how gaslighting works. But with gaslighting, you don't convince somebody eventually that you're right because it's something that you repeat over and over again. You start to make them think that they're crazy. And that really is where we should draw the line, given some of the other things that are happening right now with U.S. households. And that is When your paycheck growth is not keeping up with what it costs to put food on the table, put gas in the gas tank, the roof over your head, if it's not keeping up with the pace of rent growth, even though that's coming down in most major markets in the United States as massive supply comes online, that's the good news. But again, these things occur with a lag. We don't change where we live every month. We don't move every even 6 months. It's more like every 12 months or 18 months. And first you have to know that you can, move a few blocks away to a new build and pay movers less than you had to before because they have less business than they had before, and actually get your rent to come down. But news of this tends to spread by word of mouth. In the meantime, household charge-offs, and this is the amount of money that banks are writing off based on losses on loans that they've made to households. In the meantime, household charge-offs are telling some different tales. Remember that there was a 19-month federal eviction moratorium. Well, the moratorium on foreclosures, on making foreclosures, the moratorium on mortgage payments if you owned a home, that lasted even longer, especially in the case of FHA mortgages. So how did that play out? Well, as you can see with those pink bars, charge-offs on residential mortgages are at very, very low levels historically. Now, the same cannot be said for the orange bars and for the green bars. And this is a reflection of the fact that even after federal stimulus checks stopped flowing, Americans had grown accustomed to spending in a different manner. Some might even say spending well above their means. And banks see that in rising charge-offs. So they're writing off more bad debts for car loans that have never been repaid. Repossessions are occurring at the fastest pace since 2019, when the U.S. economy of its own volition was sliding into recession prior to the pandemic, giving the U.S. federal government an excuse to pump what we're pushing $13 trillion of spending into the U.S. economy to forestall recession. That was a pretty hefty price that we paid indeed. Same thing goes for credit card charge-offs. Banks are losing more money than they have in a very long time, in generations, on credit card bad debts that they're writing off. Just because charge-offs for residential mortgages are at very low levels, that doesn't mean that you can go out and access financing to buy a new home or buy a new home, especially if you don't have a job anymore. Now, you're told again by the media that everything is just peachy in the housing market, that the housing market remains red hot. Well, guess what? Not pictured, but we've got this on good authority from many different sources, is the fact that in a season when we typically see housing inventory decline, we're seeing it rise really fast. We've got housing inventory now in certain cities north of where it was in 2019. Same can be said for, as an aside, automobile. On dealership lots, automobile inventory, that's also increased. But when you don't have a job, or if your spouse loses his or her job and you don't have that same access to financing and lending standards are clamping down, what you do see is rising cancellation rates. And that's exactly what we're seeing. And we're seeing quite a few new homes match that on the market, and even more new homes coming onto the market in addition to what you can rent. My message is, if today's theme is about gaslighting, it really, really pays to open your eyes, to ask around, to look and see where the supply is. Are there cities where there's not very much new supply coming online and we're seeing rents rise really fast? Yes. New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, New Haven, Connecticut. Cities that have seen out-migration in recent years. If you're an apartment developer, you're going to throw up a whole bunch of new apartments in those cities when you know that the populations are shrinking? Well, no, you're not. And that's when things come down to the law of supply and demand, Econ 101. So be careful when you hear rents nationwide are going up, when in fact, a lot of it is being skewed by markets in which there's not that much supply. But in places like Austin, Texas, or in Phoenix, or Dallas, Texas, or for heaven's sake, Miami, you're seeing inventory go up really quickly. If you're in a major market, especially one that has seen growth in a post-pandemic world. Ask around. Find out about the new sources of supply on the housing market, whether it be to buy or to rent, depending on your set of circumstances, because in many, many cases, nationwide, unless it's a really tight market for reasons of its own, then you're going to find that it is indeed cheaper for you to call the moving van and find new digs. So just bear that in mind. It's interesting to see, especially given who I know you are, the demographic watching this, where we're seeing a lot of delinquencies with households. We're seeing delinquencies that are transitioning into balances that are transitioning into delinquencies at a very high level for those making the least amount of money. Of course, you know that. That makes perfect sense. But by the same token, we're also seeing a lot of overstretchedness on the part of Gen Zers and millennials who should be further into their earning years. And yet you've got 15% of Gen Zers have maxed out their credit card limit. 12% of millennials, the biggest generation in the United States, have maxed out their credit card limits. So we have to be very careful and very wary about this moving forward. Now let's go back to what we were talking originally about, and that is the gaslighting of the US consumer. You're imagining things. There are two different ways to measure where we are in the labor market cycle. One of them is called the McKelvey rule. Another is called the SOM rule. They've both been triggered, but one says that the unemployment rate has to rise 0.3 percentage points off its lows. The other is a little stricter. It says the unemployment rate has to rise 0.5% off of its lows. Both have been triggered. Moreover, when you look at areas that lead the economy, and that would be manufacturing intensive states, where I am right now in the state of Indiana, which relies the most on the manufacturing industry, or leisure and hospitality states. That's something that we do when we have discretionary income. We're also seeing that job claims are rising at the fastest pace, and therefore people's ability to quit their jobs is falling at the fastest pace. The take this job and shove it factor, if you will. In addition to that, we've seen the McKelvey rule triggered in 65% of the states. The SOM rule's been triggered in 37% of the states. The time we were there in 2008 with the SOM rule, we were 5 months into recession. With respect to the McKelvey rule, we were 7 months into recession by that time. And that would put us actually back around, October, November of 2023, given where we already are. So, my point is, and I think we'll end here today, but my point is, you're not imagining things. And the same way you might tell a niece or a nephew or somebody in high school or middle school, don't believe everything you hear on TikTok, or don't believe everything you see. Gee, that person's using a filter, or whatever it may be. There's absolutely no reason for you to believe what you're reading in the mainstream media, when what we're seeing in revisions to the official data is what's doing the game of catch up. What we're seeing in the official data, that's what's catching up to the reality that you are seeing on the ground. The reality of my neighbor just lost his or her job, and it still costs a heck of a lot of money to buy a loaf of bread or fill up my gas tank. You're not imagining any of it. Again, understand the context of where we are, mere months away from a presidential election, and the fact that it definitely pays in certain circumstances to try and paint a picture that is rosier than what reality is. But again, next time you see a version of gaslighting, next time you see a headline that says Americans wrongly see that we're in recession, stop, think twice, think for yourself, ask around you, because sometimes word of mouth and what you're hearing from your peers and your colleagues, that's where reality lies, not in the official data, which again, it's playing a big game of catch up. We can wait for that to happen. But in the meantime, know the truth and know that the truth comes from within you. That's all I'm going to leave you with today. Again, this is Danielle DiMartino Booth with my great friends here at ITM Trading, and I will look forward to the next time we speak. Maybe it'll be at the Rules Symposium in July from Boca Raton. Until then, enjoy the beginning of your summer, and thanks so much for your time today. Take care.